Welcome to this Heritage College and Seminary sponsored online symposium on biblical ecclesiology and ministry in a pandemic. We may not live in the best of times or the worst of times, but we certainly live in strange times that we've all been experiencing now for the last few months. And churches, pastors, other leaders have had to make many kinds of adjustments during this time. So in this online symposium, I'm chatting with friends of mine who are involved in ministry in the church and academy as we seek to think about what it means to live out the biblical picture of the church in these interesting and unusual times. So joining me today would be Todd Dugard, who is the lead pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel, Barrie. Aaron Rock, who is the lead pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel, Windsor. Steve West, who is the lead pastor of Crestwick Baptist Church in Guelph and an adjunct professor at Heritage College and Seminary, and my longtime faculty colleague, David Barker. We seek to talk today for our edification and hopefully for yours to help us strengthen our understanding about what it means to be the church and what it means to do ministry, pastoral, and otherwise in this time. I'm Stan Fowler, Professor Emeritus at Heritage College and Seminary, and I'll be trying to moderate the discussion as we go along today. So let me dive right in. Now, we all know all too well some of the basic changes of ministry that have happened in terms of our inability to meet in person in all the ways we normally would. Province declared a state of emergency and so has laid down regulations for what can and can't be done in so many ways. So we understand about that, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But first, I want to ask you three, who are serving in lead pastoral ministry, how has your pastoral ministry changed during the time of this pandemic? Any of the three of you may speak now.
Well, I'll go. So it has obviously been interesting. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be on this symposium. I'm very grateful for the Ministry of Heritage College and Seminary. My undergraduate degree is from that school. And I've certainly been blessed by the ministry of Dr. Barker and others that I had as professors back in the day. So I'm certainly thankful to be a part of this and have spent a little bit of my life invested in heritage as well. So I hope that our time together is a blessing to many. So yeah, things definitely have been very different. I think the way I've interacted with my leadership has been different. We've met more frequently and our conversation has been less broad and more focused in on how to manage our ministry and how to effectively interact with people in light of the crisis we've been through. So I think our elders and I and our staff in a certain sense have drawn closer together during this time. Not so much because we've been meeting in person, but we've met more frequently on Zoom and through electronic means. So that I think has been good for us to find ourselves in a bit of a crisis. I think that the managerial side of the church, when you're in a decent sized ministry, there's a lot of meetings and there's a lot of management, and a lot of that's been set aside during this crisis. And I've had more time to interact with people one-on-one. And in a certain respect, I described it this way. I feel like I'm a bit more of an old school country pastor in many respects, because I've spent more time on the phone, especially in the early weeks, interacting with people. But then there's a part of me that I feel has had to sort of leave my flock behind to pursue the reopening of Ontario churches. So I would say early on, there was more of a one-on-one dimension to my ministry. And then as things progressed and I felt compelled to press our government for reopening our churches, I almost felt as though I had to turn the congregation over to our other pastors and elders for a period of time and engage in a more public level with officials, municipal officials, and provincial officials to try to reopen the church. And now that things are slowly moving back to a semblance of normalcy, I feel that I'm starting to think through a certain sense of disconnectedness from a large portion of our church. You know, being in church where you can read people's faces and dialogue with them in the foyer, and people show up at the church building, or they're, you know, on a weekly basis, you're in different ministry contexts. I felt I had more of my thumb on the pulse of the church, and I haven't felt that for several months. So that's been a difficult adjustment for me. So I've had to primarily take my cues from a small group, a select group of people in our church. Also the church that's enabled me to continue to lead on some level. So I would say those are some things that come to mind that have changed in my pastoral approach.
Okay. Todd or Steve, either one. Let's pick. Todd, you go first.
You want me to go? Okay. Yeah, I think one of the advantages to having a ministry model that was decentralized pre-COVID was that you could then lean hard on that once you go into a crisis mode where you're not meeting in a corporate way on weekends. So the very nature of our ministry with a small group model, being a church of small groups, meant that the care function had some aspects that changed as a result of COVID, but the core of how we care for one another and the way we do ministry was already intact, and that continued. And what was really encouraging for us was, we just heard of small groups that immediately mobilized without really even our encouragement to start meeting in Zoom rooms and Google Hangouts and such. And, their text groups that they have on WhatsApp or whatever were already, they were just continuing because they were already existing. And so we set up some kind of, let's make sure people are cared for. And then we noticed that our small groups were already, actively engaged in caring for people. So the big concern became, how do we care for people who are not connected in the small group network? And we put some things in place as a pastoral team to really try and catch some of those individuals, and then to begin caring for the community at large in case we heard of any needs. And we set some things up that were different than what we were doing before, leveraging our Hope Fund, which is our benevolent fund, getting people to donate and create a large reserve there, and then leveraging that for both in the church and outside of the church needs that we would hear of. So those were a couple of things that we did that were different. Our elders undertook to call not everybody in the church. I know some churches were doing that. They were kind of working through the entire membership or attendee list and calling everybody. We didn't do that, but we did kind of some selective calling of key leaders, and again, kind of, in our minds, just kind of respecting that, the Jethro principle of leaders of tens and leaders of hundreds and leaders of thousands, and really trying to respect the network we'd already set up to make sure that people were caring for each other. Because I didn't feel like I could bear that load. And even our pastoral team, who are now actively engaged in trying to make significant logistical decisions about how to do church, and how to do live streaming, which we were not doing live streaming prior, so we needed to pivot quickly to that. So much energy was going into the infrastructure of the church itself that we were really leaning on the existing care network to make sure our people were still loved on and cared for. And every indication is that that's really happening in the church. We're loving the stories that we're hearing coming out of our small groups and the things that we had set up. So that's just a couple of things. I mean, obviously, we made a ton of different decisions about. We actually saw, I would just say this, we actually saw, 3 different phases. And phase 1 was everything from the time the lockdown started on March 13th to Easter, where I felt like we were making decisions, and I'm sure Steve and Aaron would say this too, you felt like you were making decisions that an hour later could be changed. And it was just this constant change up until I think we got to Easter. We accomplished that. And then I think there was like a new normal from Easter until the time that Premier Ford said that we could go back. And now we're into, I believe, a third phase of what this lockdown has really looked like. So the staff team's been really occupied with all of that. And of course, then there's been things in children's ministry and youth and how we're caring for our youth and our children that are very specific to those. Front door drop-offs with our kids ministry and things like that. And nothing innovative that we're doing. I mean, a lot of churches are doing stuff like this. So,
okay, good. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct. Most pastors who in Ontario know their own challenges and how they've had to work. And I won't repeat the things that Aaron and Todd have said that apply to us here as well. We have a few staff members who are in the vulnerable sector. And so we've had to figure out how do we manage even office staff when some of our pastors and staff can't even be in the building. So we feel divided that way. We're doing our best to try to sort that out. One of the things that I think has actually been very helpful has been that and I agree completely with Todd that this has not just been one monolithic time. There have been distinct phases that we've experienced in going through this. The first couple of weeks, actually, the church was absolutely incredible in terms of contacting staff with encouragement, like anything we did. And even putting out like a poor quality video that people would write in, thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. And we had all kinds of people writing in. If there's anything anyone in the church needs, tell us. We can get groceries for them. Do people need phone calls? So we actually saw a real mobilization, not from the staff level down, but from everyone in the church reaching out and wanting to make sure that people were being cared for. In fact, we had a number of university students. It was a really beautiful thing. We had a number of university students from the very beginning who contacted the church and said, if there are seniors or anyone who needs a phone call, let us know, create a list. We want to reach out to them. So one of the things that we've found as a staff very quickly was that even the time of calling someone, if you have any size of congregation, it's too much for the staff. The church body had to all use their own gifts to take care of each other, or people were going to fall through the cracks and ministry was not going to get done. So I think in that way, that's actually a very positive lesson for us as a church to see how important it is not for people to look at their staff as the people who serve and do all of the ministry, but the staff are just supposed to equip and help the church, and it's the body that does the work. And so we actually, in some ways, were able to offload a lot of ministry responsibility onto people who were willingly volunteering, and that was a wonderful thing because we have been very limited, as everyone knows. We've been very limited in what we can do as pastors and staff in terms of personal contacts and time. One thing I'll say is, as these phases have gone through, have unfolded, we also find ourselves spending an inordinate amount of time trying to get accurate information about what we're allowed to do in clear ways so we can figure out how to interpret properly and how to execute. So you kind of feel like in some ways, we've all become quasi-lawyers, trying to understand what is even possible. And the information has been so, and I'm not blaming it. Everyone's doing the best they can at all levels of government and society and all the rest. But a lot of the information has been fairly opaque or ambiguous in some ways, and then you get clear requirements in some ways, but they seem almost impossible to implement. So we've spent a ton of time just trying to manage what are we even allowed to do now.
Yeah, I get that. Your reference to some staff members who are in the vulnerable part of the population reminds me that, given my age, I suppose I'm there. I'm part of the vulnerable segment of the population. All of you have multiple staff members of various sizes, but all of you do, as is true in my church as well. I think in talking with our lead pastor, probably the change of ministry was less for him than for the other staff members. Because for him, as lead pastor of a multiple staff, much of his ministry was focused on preaching and teaching and then leading the staff. And that continues. And yet, for a staff member like say a student ministries pastor. Well, suddenly he doesn't have the possibility of being there with the students in the same way that he has. So his ministry has shifted much more in the direction of ministry to students at a distance and also ministry to parents to seek to enable ministry in the family. With that, I don't want to get into details, but would it be fair to say, in your experience, that maybe the change was even greater for other people on the ministry staff than for you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. Even in thinking of everyone who's employed by the church, we have custodians who, some of whom, because of their age, haven't been able to be in the building. Well, that's an awfully big change in terms of your job description. When you're employed to clean the building, you can't come in the building. For our children's ministry, there's only so much you can do. And people have, I think a lot of people have had enough of Zoom. I mean, not this one. This one's fantastic. But there's been so many online things for kids. The church everyone's doing their best. We have a music and worship director who not only puts our music together, but helps in terms of actually directing the flow of our worship services. And so there's all kinds of things that you just literally can't do anymore, or you have to find new ways of working it, or you have to find actually new ministry things to do. For me, there's always meetings, there's always phone calls, there's always conversation, there's the preaching, teaching videos that we're doing and all of the rest. So probably my life has changed less than any of my staff members, and it's been more stressful for them in some ways.
Yeah, I think the hard part for the lead guys would be just caring for your staff team. Certainly there's the change in, now I have to preach to a camera. I don't have anybody in the room. So that's a substantive change, and getting used to that, took some guys longer than others, but certainly that was a change. But I think bearing the burden for the final decisions about how this is going to play out is still something that in a lot of ways a lead pastor bears alone. So I agree with Steve. The busy work of how to actually execute on the ministry all week long has been a substantive change for the staff. But bearing the weight of decisions that we were never really equipped to make, first of all, and then caring for that team, like feeling that shepherding, loving care for the people that are on your staff team, I think that's been the biggest thing for me, watching their fatigue level, monitoring how meetings are going but we have a very social team and we love to be together, and there's a lot of interplay back and forth in our office during the week. And so to have that, we eat lunch together and a lot of involvement in each other's lives personally, to have that all taken away completely changes the dynamic of working together. And when you're only seeing each other on Zoom calls, it reduces a significant portion of how you do ministry, which is in relationship. And I think that's been the biggest loss, is just the taxing effect on the staff and how that's affected their ability to execute. And my team's been stellar, and I'm sure Steve and Aaron would say the same thing. Our teams have been stellar and incredible during this season.
Yeah, I would agree. Preaching in front of a camera to an empty room is frankly just weird. You do acclimatize yourself to it, but it's weird. And it's really not the way it's supposed to be, but we make the best of it. I think a certain part of our staff, their work just amped right up. So anybody who's involved in Sunday morning, quote unquote, production, like Todd, we didn't stream before primarily for philosophical reasons, because we didn't want people to stay home. But now that people are home, we had to amp that up really quick. There's been a lot of technological stuff behind the scenes that we had to get running, and then some training for people in our church, especially in the older demographic that had never used Zoom or these kinds of platforms. So there was a lot of training. Some of our guys were just like on the phone with older folks saying, okay, this is how you do it, sort of walking them through that. I think for me, initially it was like, okay, what do I do? Because none of us have ever led through something like this. I mean, the oldest pastor in Canada has never led through something like this. So there's nobody to look to. There's no book written on this. So like Steve said, you feel like you sort of have to all of a sudden, get out your high school civics notes and figure out, do a refresher on what it means to be a Christian in relationship to government. You're answering people's questions. You are trying to sort through in your own mind what the appropriate response would be, what the right timing is for when to say what you need to say. So there's all of that. So I think my ministry did change pretty significantly. I think the staff that struggled the most were the ones that were used to, like the youth and the women's ministry and that, the ones that are used to ministering to clusters of people during the week at different times. When everything now goes to online, well, how do you really counsel and follow up with people? How do you minister to youth, some of whom live in the county, right? And the county has terrible internet, like rotten internet. We actually live in the county now. Our internet is atrocious. So trying to, minister to a group of kids where they're cutting in and out, the internet's not working, and people are again not being held accountable, which I think is maybe we'll talk to that in a little bit. I think that was one of the major losses in our time of lockdown, just good old fashioned accountability. That changed a lot. Facility guy was still on site. We do have one guy on staff who is in the senior category. His personality is he just really didn't care. So he sort of throttled back a little bit, but when he was needed, he did what he needed to do, and otherwise was pretty relaxed about it. So yeah, I think there was significant changes. We lost a couple people during the shutdown who quote unquote went to other churches. I'm not really sure how that works, but they went to other churches. People somehow who now come to our church, even though they haven't been here yet, apparently. So there's definitely been some changes in that respect. And of course, we're looking forward to sort of moving back into some, I don't want to call it new normal, I call it a new temporary.
Yeah.
Until we can really get up and running.
Yeah, I get that. Now, we want to think theologically about the biblical picture of what it means to be the church and how that relates to the situation we're in. So one of the questions would be, what kind of biblical principles of ecclesiology are difficult or impossible to really practice in this time? So let me just dive right to one of the most obvious one. The biblical exhortation found in Hebrews 10, for example, to not forsake assembling together. Did we sinfully violate Hebrews 10 by ceasing to meet during the lockdown? Okay, Dave, you're not a lead pastor, but now you're invited into the conversation as well.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Yeah, my answer, just hang on.
These are the wonders of meeting virtually, Okay, he's back.
Yeah, okay, I'm back. My daughter is calling me. My quick and definitive answer is no, we're not. The whole business of don't forsake has everything to do with abandonment with the intention to abandon. To have the church has been meeting for 2,000 years, and to go into a hiatus because of a pandemic for 12 or 18 months is hardly abandoning, at least at the broadest level of what church is hardly abandoning in a violation of Hebrews 10:25. So my quick answer is no. By all means, like for example, we go on vacation sometimes, and we may or may not go to church while we're traveling or on vacation. Is that abandoning it? Is it violating of Hebrews 25? I would say no, it's not. Again, the context and the word, in my view, has everything to do with abandoning with the intention to abandon, and that's not even close to what we're dealing with
Yeah, I think I would agree with the issue of intentionality. If a person just says, baseball's my priority on Sundays, so I don't go to church because I play baseball, that's just my thing, then I think you're violating the Hebrews 10:25 passage. Or if you have the Lone Ranger Christian mindset, where your mindset is, it's just me and Jesus on an island. We like to hang out on Sunday mornings. I don't need to be part of the church. The church has caused me too much pain, or there's not really any advantage to me being in a community of faith. And I think it's a violation of that. I would, however, suggest that we need to consider the issue of why does God have that prohibition in Hebrews 10:25? And I would suggest that it's because the Bible presents the very high view of what it means to gather. We are embodied creatures. Adam, in a perfect environment, had a problem that Eve remedied. When we're called together, when we're called to faith in Jesus Christ, we're called into a dynamic spiritual community. We are part of a body, the body of Christ. We have different spiritual gifts that each of us bless and benefit one another with. And so while I would not feel comfortable saying that we violated Hebrews 10:25, I do believe that Hebrews 10:25 calls us to fight for the opportunity to gather. So rather than having a passive approach and basically sitting back and saying, okay, we'll wait for the government to tell us, here's the green light to meet. I think the fact that the Bible has a very high view, so high of a view that we're commanded not to forsake it, that it requires that we fight and we always push for it. Because one of my concerns is we live in a very secularized culture, and the culture doesn't understand the benefit and blessing of God's people gathered. And you watch television shows, the criminal's running down the street from the cops and he runs into a church, and it's always this big cavernous building with nothing going on in it. And this is the stereotype I think that the world has of the church. So while we didn't violate it, I do think there would be an implicit violation of that passage if we didn't fight as best as we can with all the considerations in place for the right and opportunity to gather together as God's people.
Okay. Maybe that's a good point. Good place to ask another question. I've had in our church, I've had some people raise the question, why don't we be bold like the church, the persecuted church in other parts of the world who meet in defiance of government orders? Why don't we be bold and be even though the government tells us we can't? Why aren't we as faithful as the persecuted church? Is that a helpful argument?
I actually think the argument is disrespectful and demeaning of those who are truly being persecuted. This is a pandemic which changes the terms of reference. We're not being told by the government that we can't preach the gospel. In fact, I would argue, and Aaron's already alluded to it, we've had increased opportunities to preach the gospel to people who were not entering the doors of our church and not tuning into our online sermons prior, but are doing so now and actually interacting with us about that. We have multiple stories like that. I've talked to lots of pastors, and they're all seeing the same pattern of unbelievers who are actually watching full services, either with family members or at the encouragement of others. And it's been really awesome to see what God is doing in these days with that, giving us evangelistic opportunities we didn't have before. So I think the terms of reference are really different and to say that we should fight, as Aaron said, to fight for the right to meet. I agree with that premise, but I would say that the timing at which you fight for that should not be during a pandemic when there's a worldwide health threat to people. If it was the government saying, we don't want you to meet because we don't believe your message, we don't want you preaching the gospel, we don't want the name of Jesus uttered, then for sure I'm meeting. I'm going to get people together in whatever way I can, and I'll put my own life at risk to do that. But when the risk is to people who actually don't have Jesus, when the risk is a virus that could actually take people out who don't have Jesus, then the law of love supersedes. And I have to express that love to my community by saying, I'm going to now click over to Romans 13, and I'm going to honor the governing officials who really are, with the best available information, trying to make decisions that are keeping our communities safe. And I want to, as the exiles did in Babylon, I want to seek the peace of the city that I'm living in. I think it's just about timing. It's not about the principle of arguing for meeting. It's just, when do you fight that battle? Not right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, I say, Todd, I really concur with that in terms of the analogy with the persecuted church. In the last 4 years, I've taught courses in 3 countries where they have legitimate persecution. One is still a closed country. One still has a significant level of persecution. Another one was part of the Eastern Soviet bloc. So they're not persecuted now, but the people I was teaching had experienced genuine persecution. And there is no analogy whatsoever between the real persecution that people have experienced for their faith in Jesus and the reasons why we haven't been able to meet. The government, even now, in part of this second phase, has opened up, has allowed for worship services in the modified format. We're going to be able to meet in the future without any restrictions whatsoever. We have never been told what we can or can't say for our online propagation and teaching. There's no restrictions whatsoever on our own teaching, proclamation of the gospel, etc. So, in terms of are we persecuted? No, it's you can imagine 5 guys sitting around talking about how the government is persecuting sports leagues because we're hockey players and hockey we can't play hockey right now, and it's clear that they're targeting hockey and we're persecuted for our sport. Well, no, you're not. Groups larger than 5 haven't been able to meet. It's been a deductive argument. Are you a group larger than 5? You can't meet. So, maybe they're wrong. Maybe it's been an overreaction. But this isn't religiously based whatsoever. And to make it seem like we're persecuted for righteousness or the gospel is to cultivate a martyr complex, which is beyond belief to me. And I think demeaning to those who actually have suffered for their faith, not as part of a universal application of rules, which we may not agree with. We may not agree with their response to the government, but it has been fairly universally applied. Another thing too, just in terms of the Hebrews 10 passage, to make one comment about it, is the part about not gathering together isn't even a sentence. It's in the middle of a sentence where there's a whole variety of things you're supposed to do. And the previous sentence says that you're supposed to consider, hold on to the hope that you profess, don't let go of that hope, but also consider how you may spur one another on towards good deeds and love. I don't see any church that hasn't been doing that during this time. And in fact, a lot of churches have been working even harder to figure out how can we spur each other on to love and good deeds during this time. So with Dave Barker, this isn't abandonment at all. In fact, I think a lot of the churches have actually come together more in terms of caring for one another and trying to care for one another. And then the other part of that sentence at the end is to encourage one another as you see the day approaching. I think our churches are trying to encourage people. So there's no abandonment here. And I do agree with Aaron in the sense that maybe we haven't appreciated how important it is for the church to meet. It is the body of Christ. We are embodied beings. The physicality and social element of worship and body expression is very important. But in terms of fighting, I want to say, yes, we want to fight for the right of the church to meet, but that depends on the reasons why the church isn't allowed to be meeting in the society. And if the reason is because the society hates the gospel, that's one thing. Although even there, the persecuted church in a lot of parts of the world isn't meeting openly and brashly in defiance of the government. That's why there's the underground church. People are very careful. And you sometimes go a very long period of time without meeting in these countries where there's real opposition and persecution. That should be said as well. But I'm not sure that I just agree that it's either passive or aggressive. I mean, it depends on whether or not you agree with the regulations that are being put in place. So I suspect that some people who want to fight just actually don't think the COVID situation is that serious. And that drives a lot of it. They just don't think it's serious. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe the government has overreacted. But I don't think we can allow our subjective impressions to determine sort of our view of when the right time is to fight. I have no medical expertise whatsoever. I don't think anyone who signed the petition to reopen churches has any medical expertise either. And so at some point, I think you do need to listen to those who actually have advanced medical training, whether you agree with them or not. Do we actually have the expertise and competence to weigh in on those issues about how to manage a pandemic? I certainly don't. And so I don't feel the need to throw my weight into fight to get churches to reopen if I'm not sure what's going on, when I don't think we're violating any biblical principles. So I just think the pugilistic language, I agree with it in terms of the principle of how important church is, but it's the application of it. And I'll shut up in just 1 second, just to say this. I've read a few books in the last couple of years on disease and plague transmission in the ancient world. And the bubonic plague in London, England in 1665 devastated the entire city. Numbers vary, but up to maybe 100,000 people died because of the bubonic plague. And it raged from about in April through October. And I'll tell you, if I was a pastor in London, knowing about the germ theory of disease and virus transmission the way we do today, I'd be fighting for the churches to be closed during that entire time, not fighting for them to be open. So I partly wonder if it's just we fight when we think something's serious or not in terms of the threat level.
Yeah. Okay. Let me come at it from another angle. It would be possible to say we don't think the government is persecuting the church because, as we've pointed out, there was no the regulation against gathering was about mass gatherings. It wasn't about being the church, but it's about all kinds of mass gatherings, and it wasn't about essential or non-essential service. Really, it was about mass gatherings. So one might argue the church is not under persecution, and yet one might also argue that it appeared that the government was ignoring the significance of places of worship and not giving enough thought to the possibility of reopening. Now, Aaron, is it fair to say that something like that was behind the letter that you and Joe Boot put together and for which you got signatories to appeal to the government? Did you have the sense that the government was in some way ignoring the needs of churches and therefore a conversation needed to start? Am I reading the situation rightly?
Well, I don't have any desire to be acknowledged by the government. So I wouldn't go to the government and say, hey, what about little me over here? Like, you forgot about me, please recognize me. There was no desire for an acknowledgement from the government, like we exist. Why are you treating us as a non-essential service? But the comments that Steve and Todd have made, I have huge respect for these guys. We're all leading as best as we can. I think that I would be the odd man out in terms of how I'm interpreting what's going on. I think there's several statements. With due respect, I actually disagree with almost every statement that they made, point by point. But it flows from, I don't think we're being persecuted. I taught in China in 2005 and 2006. I was teaching men that had been to jail for 3 years for pastoring little churches in rural areas. One guy's brother had the tar beat out of him so much that he died the day after he was released from jail. So I understand that. But if you have your finger on the pulse of Canadian culture, I would say the number one problem for the last 20, 30 years in our country is the fact that we don't have overt persecution. It's very subversive. It's very subversive. The secularization of the church is rampant and prevalent. I do not trust the government, not because they're overtly trying to persecute the church and imprison pastors, but for the very reason that there's a passive indifference and ignorance towards almost every category of biblical teaching. And this is why we lose so many of our young people in our churches, because we put them through our youth groups. We have them in church on Sunday morning, but But the spiritual neutrality, the passivity in our culture is absolutely deadly and strips them of their spiritual vitality. And so I don't think that we've been persecuted on the level of that's not totally true, because there were algorithms on Facebook and on social media platforms that were trying to catch you speaking out against issues related to the virus. I taught an 8-hour course in our church on a global response to the pandemic. And I think only in the very last class did I ever even use the word corona or COVID or pandemic, for the specific reason that the algorithms were such that they were closing down online platforms that were using this kind of language. So there was a certain subtle form of censorship. And the reality is, if we move forward meeting just in online platforms, the possibility for censorship is much greater than if we're meeting in person. In terms of, so I would say, first of all, yeah, we're not being persecuted in the same way that the Chinese are, but there's a passivity that really concerns me. And when this all happened, at first I'm like, okay, I'm going to do what the officials and the experts want me to do. But then I started seeing the hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of allowing great numbers of people in Costco. You go into Costco, people are very close together. The beer store is open, and I don't have a problem with people having a beer. I have one myself once in a while, but the beer store is open. That's not necessary. People are lined up at Home Depot to buy paint. You really have to paint your church or your kitchen if people are dying? No, you do not. These are not essential services. These are not necessary. And then when we started having conversations with the government officials, and I was in meetings with the ministers of health and with their attorneys, it became very clear to me that you get what you want politically and you don't get what you want if you stand on the sidelines. And so I thought to myself, man, if this is really absolutely about a medical issue, and I'm not denying the virus. I'm not a conspiracy guy, although the reality is there has not been a pandemic in Canada. There's not been a pandemic. 8,200 Canadians have died from the COVID virus in 3 months. In 2019, 72,000 people died every quarter in Canada. A pandemic, by definition, is where massive amounts of the population die. We didn't see that in Canada. People died. The virus is a deadly virus, but we were never in a pandemic in Canada. That's just a fact. And to call it a pandemic, I think, is to deny the data. So when I started seeing so many different groups being allowed to meet, and then the protests, I think, are what pushed me over the edge. When you allow tens of thousands of people to protest, when you have government officials that are saying, no, the church is limited to 5, they can't meet, but we're going to allow the protest. I don't know how you interpret that as anything other than a spiritual battle. Again, it's not overt, it's not deliberate. I don't think there's anyone in Ottawa or in Queen's Park saying, oh, I'm going to persecute the church, I'm going to shut the church down. But their passive indifference toward the church, I think, was pretty significant. I would also argue that evangelism hasn't increased. You know, when we first started our online services, we had 1,300 viewers the first week. That's gone down to about 300 different devices. There's no way to follow up on people. A lot of these people are just people from other churches, I think, that are watching, and churches that don't have the technological know-how to run their own services. I think evangelism is one of my, greatest. What would I say? One of the things I mourn the most is the lack of evangelistic opportunity. And then finally, because I could go on and on and on about this, but finally, we do have medical experts in our church. I have a physician in my church that worked with COVID patients. And I don't know how public this video is going to be, but he thought the whole lockdown was ridiculous. I have nurses in my church that worked with COVID patients in the Detroit hospitals. They thought the lockdown was ridiculous. I have the vice president of a local hospital that said this is like way over the top. So this is not just Pastor Aaron making decisions with his Bible in front of him. We did consult the experts. And if you go outside of the paid technocrats in the Ontario government, I think you'd actually find many, many many medical practitioners who would say, yeah, this was a little heavy-handed and it's unnecessary and you should actually push back.
Okay, let me make a comment as moderator. I've gone on record myself as saying I wish we could have a honest public debate in Ontario about whether the lockdown of this nature is the best way to actually deal with the COVID-19 issue. But I'm gonna drag us back a bit to questions of biblical ecclesiology and how the church functions. I mean, there's a legitimate argument to be had. I think I agree, Aaron, that there's been a lot of censorship. There's been a lot of shutdown of experts, epidemiologists, and infectious disease specialists who I've heard make the case for a much more focused kind of protection of the vulnerable rather than a massive lockdown. But that's a bit of another issue. One of the, some of the practical questions that come up in terms of being the church in a time like this is, how do we practice baptism and the Lord's Supper? And there's been debate among good people about that. So for the four of you, what's your perspective on that?
Well,
Okay.
Yeah, so we've already practiced the Lord's table in Zoom rooms, and for us, as we examined it, we believe that the significant command about the Lord's table is, do this in remembrance of me. It's often as you do it. It's the doing of it as opposed to the particular details around how it's done. So what particular elements you use, or the timing of it, or who's in the room, or who's conducting it. Those to me are all details. And I find that what we've done with the Lord's table and baptism, I think, is we've over-institutionalized these two ordinances in an attempt, I believe, to kind of legitimize ourselves and to be almost, to Catholicize what we do and entrench them in a way that we're firming up our ecclesiology in a way that I don't think God ever intended for us to do. Again, to give ourselves some legitimacy. And I thought about, as the evangelical church, it's almost like we're looking at the institutional churches and going, oh, we want to be as legitimate as those churches are. So we're gonna formalize these things and control how they're done and make people take classes, and you can't do it this way. You have to do it this way. It has to be under the confines of the church and done in this way. And we've almost, like the Catholic Church, we've made an idol out of ecclesiology. And I think we want to be really careful about that, because we're very short on details about both of these ordinances. And I would be, I'd be more in favor of if Jim leads his neighbor to Jesus, that Jim baptizes his neighbor in his neighbor's pool with some witnesses around. And I'd be fine with that, because I can't see anything that specifically puts baptism under the purview of elders or an ecclesiastical structure. I mean, it should just be practiced. And the same with the Lord's table. Was it ideal when we do it in the Zoom room as opposed to in the room? Not ideal. But David eating the bread of the presence wasn't ideal. I think we see a situation that's an exception to the rule. It's a violation of maybe the normative ways of doing it, but it's the best we have in order to remember the Lord.
I think it's interesting when we say it's a violation of the normative way. The normative way is not the normative way that information we do have from the New Testament.
Right.
We've already changed it massively, sitting in pews with little cups. And Eucharist is always in the context of a meal, as far as we can tell in the New Testament. So the fact that we have changed it again into a different form, we've already massively changed the form. As you say, we have little information about what's going on, but we certainly know about that. But somehow we legitimize the fact that we can sit in pews with little cups and say we're celebrating Eucharist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a person who is reading the Last Supper account. Obviously, Jesus is meeting in the upper room with his disciples. So the minimal takeaway as an extension of the Old Testament Passover would be the communion or the Lord's Supper on some level is a gathered exercise. It wouldn't be sinful, I wouldn't think. I just don't believe there's a biblical precedent for an individual having communion, by himself at his dinner table. It is a gathered exercise where together we acknowledge God's redemption of his people, right? In Passover, it was God's redemption of his people, not just God's redemption of Moses or Aaron or Miriam, but God's redemption of his people. So being gathered is a blessing. I have no issue then with a small group or a family taking communion. Of course, if you're part of a church and you've said, this is my spiritual family, and there's 100 or 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 people there is a blessing attached to collectively and corporately during communion. But I don't have any hang-ups about the specificities of the size of the cup or the kind of bread or these kinds of things. And I don't think we necessarily need to fight for that. Baptism is a little more challenging, whether it's in a church or outside of a church, because of physical distancing. I don't know how you would necessarily baptize someone, even if it's just you and your buddy in the Detroit. Not totally sure how you would do that. Maybe you could wear masks, I suppose. But it does present some complexities. I would say where we get robbed in not having communion together as a whole church family, or not witnessing a baptism together as a whole church family, is just in the collective sense that God is moving in our family. And together we have, in many cases, together we've evangelized this person. Together we've shared the gospel. Together we've had an influence in this person from a human perspective coming to faith. And now we get to witness the fruit of that in the baptismal experience. So that's something that I would say, for me, it's more of an issue of mourning it than feeling that we've absolutely been banned from doing it. It's just that sense of mourning the loss. I think there's something special. There's a blessing. There's a joy attached to the entire church family being able to engage in the ordinances.
Aaron, in your church, have you done communion virtually or not?
No, not as a whole church, but our small groups have done that. We intended to do it this past Sunday when we reopened, but our sterilized communion supplies were back ordered.
Okay.
Believe it or not, and this is so repulsive to me, we've had to order them from a price gouger. So we've ordered them with the hopes that they'll come in this week for like twice the money. Can you imagine someone price gouging on sending you, the prepackaged little cups? But we're hoping to do it this Sunday. We haven't done it collectively as a church, no.
Yeah, truth is stranger than fiction once again. So Steve, how about you? Have you done communion virtually at Crestwick?
No, we haven't. Although about 6 weeks ago, I was awfully tempted to when one evangelical organization put out a whole bunch of articles about how it would be sinful to do so. I thought, well, maybe we'll just try it next week then and see how sinful it is. I mean, I just one thing that just astounds me in all of this, honestly, is the dogmatism that so many people have about so many things. They're so sure they know what's going on in society. They're so sure they know what government should do. They're so sure they know what the medical experts should do. They're so sure that they know what Paul would say about Zoom communion. And I just have a hard time with that. I mean, we have one passage from Paul where he's dealing with problems in a church with all the flexibility that he has. When I say what Paul would think about Zoom communion is, all I'm really saying is what I think should happen with Zoom communion is, and I'm going to use Paul's name to justify my own belief. I mean, he was a religious genius, inspired by the Spirit, of course, but also just a religious genius. And I'm not sure about you guys, but sometimes I read someone who's brilliant, and I think I know what they're going to say about a certain topic. And then I read them on that topic and they say something totally different from what I thought they would say. And the reason is it's because they're a creative genius and I'm not. And if I could think the way they think, I'd be probably not here talking to you guys. I'd be someone important. Yeah. And so like you sort of look at that. And,
what are you saying about us, Steve?
Yeah, well, I hate to say it, but we all know it's true. And so I just look at that and think, do I really think that I know for sure what Paul would say about Zoom communion? No, he'd be teaching me. I don't have that kind of mind. Right. And so I just think that in terms of ecclesiology, yes, if we were able to meet together as normal, if we weren't in these situations, yes, we have our certain practices. We understand that. But I think that there really is a ton of flexibility in a lot of these things. And if not, at least a lot of grace. I just can't imagine God's going to be striking people down for doing the best they can to make decisions about Zoom communion or not. I think that view of God, I think, is actually pretty frightening, that people think that he's just winning and upset with people for making decisions the way they do in these sorts of situations about these kinds of issues.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. I remember at the beginning of the lockdown and when the question began to arise about, well, what do we do about the Lord's Supper? I read contrasting opinions on the Gospel Coalition website. And the more I thought about the argument that said, no, we have to be physically together to do it, the more I came to the conclusion, well, the argument is simply about what is normal in the life of the church, what was normally happening in the first century. But we aren't talking about what's normal right now. Now, Aaron and I were involved in a bit of an exchange on Facebook that I created by responding to his including baptism and communion as one of his 50 arguments about appealing to the government. And all I pointed out was that in the New Testament, we have actually neither command nor example of baptism occurring in the gathered church on the Lord's Day. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong to do it then. Aaron's pointed to some of the benefits of that. There are benefits to doing it there. But to say it must be done there in view of New Testament actual teaching is a bit strange. Let me go back to we're gonna end here soon. I think I'd indicated we roughly an hour we devote to this, and we're close to that now. I'd be interested to know from you three pastors in particular here, how did you functionally do your Sunday morning gathering? Did the pastor and a few others go to the church and live stream it from there? Did you record it in advance and then put it together to be broadcast on Sunday? Just briefly, how did you actually handle that?
For us, we decided that we weren't set up for live stream and didn't see a whole lot of advantages to trying to live stream from an empty auditorium in our particular context. So what we did was we simply recorded the videos ahead of time, edited them, and then made them go live at 9:00 on a Sunday morning. So we had our different component parts sort of videoed at different times, edited together, and then just posted so people could watch it when they wanted to. I want to make one really quick comment, though, about baptism and the Lord's Supper, though. Also, is part of the thing is, in most of our churches, we don't baptize people when they're converted anyway. There's an enormous amount of time lag in between conversion. And so I'm not sure how many baptisms we've missed out in the last 3-month window, but we're usually delaying a lot more than that. And even in the best of times, we're debating communion. Is it every week? Is it once a month? Some churches celebrate it quarterly. Some churches celebrate it once a year. And we all have our opinions. But I think it's another example of there are biblical principles, but there's dogmatic mentalities in a lot of people which have been really unhelpful, but have come out and created fissures and been divisive during this time rather than trying to bring people together. No, we're regressing to a previous comment. So I'll be quiet now.
I felt like a couple of times Stan has kind of, brought it in for a landing too early.
Yeah, well,
there's still more to say. Such a conciliatory, nice guy, Stan.
Well, we could go on for a long time about a whole lot of these things, but but we want to think in terms of capturing our audience and keeping their attention. So, okay, Todd, how did you handle the logistics of it?
Yeah, so the decision we made around the delivery of Sunday was obviously we had to pivot, as I said earlier, we had to pivot quickly to live stream. Friday the decision was made, and by Sunday we had a live stream up and running. But we were doing it before, so we had to cannibalize our existing sound equipment to create a live stream service, a live stream studio, really, and deliver that way instead. So we don't really have the ability to do both in person and live stream. So as we go back, we're now feverishly building out new production rooms to accommodate both of those. So during the last 14 weeks, we've been doing live stream only. We've done it from our church location. We got sign off from the Associate Medical Officer of Health for Simcoe Muskoka in order to be able to do that. So we had a letter from them saying that we could have 5 people in the facility delivering the services. And what's curious about this is we did consultations with our MPPs, one of whom is a cabinet minister, the Attorney General. Neither of that, both were surprised that churches were under the impression that their staff and or volunteers couldn't be in the building to deliver. What in the notion of the politicians was that there was a difference between the delivery of services, staff and volunteers working to that end, versus gathering of people. The government saw a distinction between those two things, but didn't communicate that super well. So we got clarity from our local health unit and had clearance to have 5 people in the building to do our delivery of our live stream. So as it turned out, for the majority of that time, worship was recorded on Thursdays at the facility. I preached live on Sunday. I or the other preachers preached live on Sunday mornings. It was live hosting with a 20-minute virtual lobby prior to create a lot of connection and community with people, interviews, and kind of some fun stuff, and interacting with people in the chat. And then into the live service, and the host of that virtual lobby would also do the kind of announcement time, pastoral prayer, and close off the service. And we pull that all together on Sunday morning, insert the recorded worship, so that the whole thing looked like a live experience, and gave people, because it was from the worship center, we were giving people a sense of normalcy in the midst of something that wasn't very normal. But at least they were seeing their worship center, they were seeing their worship team in that context, they were seeing the preacher in that context. And we tried to create as normal as possible during these 14 weeks.
Okay.
We had a conversation the Wednesday before the announcement came out. It was unrelated to the announcement, but I just happened to say to my worship guy, hey, if we ever wanted to do live streaming, like how far away would we be from doing that? He's like, we could probably live stream now. And I'm like, oh, okay, good. So then Friday, when everything sort of came about, I'm like, oh, can you believe it? We actually have the capacity. So we went to live stream, where we would, let me think now, this is going back 3 months. I can't remember if we recorded the music. Yeah, I think we recorded the music in advance and then live streamed the sermon. But after about 2 weeks, we went to all pre-recorded. It just allowed us to kind of put it together better. So I would come in on Friday around 1:00 in the afternoon. I'd preach my sermon to a videographer and a sound guy. Our worship leaders would come in either on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. And we were very concerned about them closing our church totally, because to Todd's point, it actually varied region by region. Up till last week, I think it was in Peel, they weren't even allowed, the staff wasn't even allowed in their buildings. I talked to 2 pastors up there. They weren't even allowed to go into their buildings. So they had to do everything from home, because their local medical officer put extra protocols on, whereas ours is a little more flexible. So we would pre-record it. We would play it on a Sunday at our 2 time slots, 9 and 11:15, and then we'd have your open chat rooms. There was a typed one, and then a one you could join on video. I think that went okay at first, but then we started hearing people, well, we'll just watch it later in the week once they found out it was pre-recorded. I know of a pastor friend of mine, they would just go for drives and watch their sermon Sunday afternoon driving around the town or driving around the county. I think people just kind of got fed up with it. And there were a tenacious few that hung in there. And when I say a few, I mean several hundred. But I think the engagement factor has dropped significantly. I think the reason for that is if you're going to go online on a Sunday morning with your family, you can watch pretty much any preacher or service in the world going back 10 or 15 years. So again, I think people were realizing that church is more than just watching a sermon or listening to music. And by the way, if you're in a household where people can't sing, I doubt there's a whole lot of families singing along with the kind of gusto that you can do if you're a terrible singer, but you're drowned out by the voices of many in an auditorium. So that's kind of how we did it. And then last week, of course, we went back to live stream, but we had our services in our facility.
Okay, I was going to ask for a brief answer to that one. So, Aaron, your church did regather again this past Sunday. Todd, have you, or when do you plan to?
So our staff is actually going to meet and make that decision this afternoon. Some of the challenges for us relate to building out the live stream and in-person capabilities. So we had to order equipment to make that possible. And so we could be looking at a couple of more weeks before we get back. And we, in sharp contrast to Aaron, and Aaron and I know this and have talked a little bit about it, we've taken a more measured, cautious approach to everything. We're just seeing the whole thing from a very different perspective. We are engaging with the government as he is, but in a different way. And we had the Attorney General on for an interview on Sunday morning in advance of our service, and showing our support for the government's decisions in the midst of a very, very difficult season, making decisions with the best information they had available. And so we've been supportive of that, and in our community, very public about that and vocal about it. I wasn't going to say anything public about it. And then Aaron's little petition and website made the news in Barrie, and he was quoted as the pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel. And so then I had to go to the reporter and say, dude, that's a different Harvest Bible Chapel, and we don't believe any of that. So, but I did. I sent it all to Aaron, and I said, just in case it makes it down to you, just so you know, I wasn't going to engage publicly, but I felt like I had to. So, we see this as just, all aspects of this, even the next phase, a tremendous and incredible opportunity for the gospel. I've been praying, we went into a building, we were 16 years of setting up and tearing down in 2 different school locations, and got our facility 2.5 years ago. And I have to admit, as a lead pastor, I was really unsettled in my own heart about where our church was at in those 2 years that we were in the building, that I just really felt like our church was settling in and becoming comfortable. And I didn't want that. And I was praying for God to shake us up in a pretty significant way. And so, I don't believe the pandemic happened because I prayed for our church to be shaken up, but I do believe that God has brought something upon the church to rattle our cage. I believe that how we respond to the circumstances we're in with respect to the government, with respect to our people, with respect to our entire philosophy of ministry, if we come back from this and the ministries just fall back into that same rut that we were in prior, we've failed. Like, some things have to change. How we staff, how we budget, how we deliver ministry, how we reach the lost, how we engage with our communities. All of it is on the table, because all of that just relates to philosophy, not the pillar and ground of truth, like not the core of what we believe. And while that remains intact, God is providing incredible opportunities in front of us right now. And I'm excited for our church to be where it is right now. Greater and great engagement in prayer, greater engagement with loved ones and friends with respect to evangelism and the gospel. I believe that when our people do come back, and Aaron can probably testify to this, like there are going to be tears in worship, and I'm already getting emails from people saying, all of a sudden I'm understanding Hebrews 10:25 in a way that I didn't understand it before. I want to be back with God's people. People who were sporadic before may become more committed and more regular now because they've missed it for so long. And so I'm seeing all this as an incredible opportunity for the church in our community. And so again, taking a more measured, cautious approach, our community knows where we stand on this issue. And if it's another 2 or 3 weeks before we get in, I think that's the decision that we're making, and then we're going to deliver an ongoing live stream experience for the majority of our congregation, who we expect will stay home, and a safe experience for those that are coming to be.
Steve, what's your schedule?
Yeah, we decided last week. I think we were all excited when we heard worship services 30% capacity. Great. We can. I mean, the math doesn't quite work out. You figure some people will stay home. We can just run 3 services, and that's our whole church. And then you start looking at the details, and that's the maximum, and it's only 30% if you abide by all the social distancing regulations. And so we pulled out our tape measures, and we measured our auditorium, and we measured secondary rooms where we can put in chairs, and kind of discovered that that's just one of the regulations. There's pages and pages of regulations. And for us, we just thought with all the goodwill in the world, as a staff and deacons board and leadership, everyone working together, we couldn't do it safely. We could not do it legally. And so we decided that, if we were going to open, I think there were a lot of churches that opened on Sunday, and their basic governing idea was, we'll do what feels safe to us. And they violated all kinds of laws in doing so. And that's not a subjective hunch. I've seen videos that people took on their iPhones, so glad to be back at church. And you can just look around and you can see people, and not family groups. There's one church I saw where there are 7 pews in a row occupied with people standing up singing. Well, that doesn't even come close to the most basic of health safety protocols. And so, so I would just really wonder, I'm sure some churches have done it and done it very, very well, but video footage I've seen from various churches where I know people, the violations were as stark and as clear as you could possibly imagine. So our view isn't to rush forward, and our view isn't to lag back. We put together a task force. We've spent hours on this in terms of actually being in the building. We've contacted the Ministry of Health. We want a local representative to walk through our building with us to show us what we can and can't do. So we want to do this as soon as we can, but we're not going to turn a blind eye to legal violations in the process. We're going to do it safely, and we're going to do it legally. We're not going to do it. And there's no time frame for that. We'll do it when we can do it, but we're not going to just charge ahead.
Steve, could you comment on I wasn't quite clear there when you said there was people standing up in rows singing or something like that? Yeah,
so I saw footage of a church where they have 7 pews in a row where people are standing up singing. So you could reach out and touch the person in front of you, seven pews deep, singing. Okay. That's a clear violation, with all the goodwill in the world, of the most basic principle of social distancing, even if they're not singing.
Right.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Okay. Yeah. A couple comments. One would be that my one comment would be that, because there's going to be pastors listening in on this, right?
Right.
I think that it's good to have differences of opinion, like the stretched elastic band pulling against itself. I do think that there has been a great amount of unhealthy division in the church. So let me give you a couple examples. Churches that reopen or have reopened, I think, are innately putting pressure they're not intending to, but they're putting pressure on churches and pastors that aren't reopening to give answer to their people. Like, why aren't we opening? These churches are reopening. Likewise, churches that aren't reopening are putting pressure on churches that are reopening because they're asking countless questions of the government to dictate down to the most minor points what they're supposed to do and not do. And they're also calling into question the wisdom of churches that have reopened. So the fact that we have basically two camps, those that have reopened and those that haven't reopened, and we see this on this platform or this symposium today, two different viewpoints. It is troublesome. Like it bothers me because I spearheaded this and I had all the conversations with the government officials and I told them what we're willing to do and not willing to do. And they agreed to that. It bothers me when people that weren't part of our initiative are then calling and asking for additional regulations, which we already said we're not going to accept on a certain level. And at the same time, I think I got an email from a pastor who's chosen not to reopen. And he was basically saying to me, are you trying to split my church? So I have my own concerns. Pastors on the other end of the equation have their own concerns. I think we need to acknowledge that it is problematic and it can cause division between brothers. At the same time, I want to say this carefully, but I am shocked at the number of churches that didn't stand with us that are even planning on reopening in 2 or 3 weeks. I don't understand that at all. Because if you understand what the officials were saying, they were not willing to open our churches for 6, 12 months, some of them 2 years. So if it's true that a pastor really trusts the experts, you shouldn't be opening your church probably for the next year. The only reason why the 30% came out is not because Doug Ford got out of bed one morning and said, I think I'm going to give the churches an opportunity. It's because of our efforts. It's because of the potential of a charter challenge, which innately demonstrates that this isn't just a medical issue. There's a political component to this. And so I think churches need to somehow figure out a way of giving answer to that. Our church, we went beyond the regulations. We spaced our pews out 8 feet. We had people sign a waiver. We had nurses in our hospital at the door with 4 digital thermometers taking temperature. We had hand sanitizer. We had people coming in a path, entering the auditorium, sitting in pews that were chairs that were all spread apart, not being allowed to stand up after the service and mingle. They could talk from across their chairs. When the time came, they got up and they had to leave through different exits. So this is way beyond what you would see in any store or any business. We're not going to do this in an ongoing way, but we did it because I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear out there, and we're trying to mitigate against that. And one of our people said, frankly, I felt way safer in church on Sunday morning than I do when I go grocery shopping. So I think churches can do it well, but to Steve's point, there are people out there that think the virus is an absolute hoax, that have not consulted medical people, and they're just going to kind of do whatever they want. And I think that's going to be a problem, but ultimately they're going to have to answer for it. But the ramifications of their decisions, if there's an outbreak in their church, is going to come back and affect guys like me that have been to the government multiple times asking for these concessions. So there's a lot of dynamics for us to think through in this.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think the whole thing in terms of reopening is that given the regulations that we have, I don't know anyone who's asking for extra regulations, but just to make sure that we're upholding the regulations that have actually been put down. And so, Aaron, it sounds like, if you're spacing your chairs out more than 2 meters apart, and they recommend double that for singing. I don't know if you guys were singing it, that doesn't matter to me. But it sounds like you guys did it right. And you might have the facility which allows for that. There are a lot of churches that don't have the facility which allows for that, or their numbers are too big compared to their auditorium size. And there's lots of ingress-egress issues and all of the rest. So I don't think it's even a matter of saying, well, there's 2 camps, the ones who want to reopen and the ones who don't, and the ones who did and the ones who haven't. I think it's more a matter of every church, if whatever the decision they make, they have to do it properly. And if that means that you are able to open, great. I think it's wonderful. If that means that we weren't allowed to open, that's the position we're in. I don't think it's a right or wrong decision in terms of should churches have been open this weekend. It's simply a matter of could churches actually open and say in good conscience they were abiding by the rules and legal regulations of their jurisdiction. Now, I want to be really careful with this too. I mean, although in terms of being pugilistic, at one point you did say you disagreed with everything I had just said. So I feel a liberty to say something similar. I didn't sign the letter because I didn't agree with it. I didn't agree with tons of what was said in it. But I also find I'm sympathetic to the point. I wasn't sympathetic to the argumentation or even attitude at points. But I think it's a little self-aggrandizing, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know how many churches there are in Ontario. I assume there's a lot more than 450. There was tons that didn't sign it. And I'm not sure that this petition had much to do with reopening churches in Saskatchewan and Alberta and BC and PEI. Maybe it did, but at some level, I'm not sure exactly how much we can say, well, because this petition was circulated and Joe Boot was going to threaten a legal challenge, the whole government, all the provincial governments across Ontario capitulated the same week. I mean, maybe that's exactly what happened. I'm not sure that is the case, though. So I think part of the problem in general is that the rhetoric from all sides has been a little bit elevated, and a lot of people have sort of taken the position that their group and their approach is sort of almost like the way of doing everything in every way, every place, every church, every government. And I'm not quite sure we haven't slightly over-exaggerated what the wisdom of our own personal decisions. We're all doing the best we can. And we have to live and let live. And if people can do it right and legally, great. And if not, if some churches can't open for a couple months, they can't open for a couple months. Some churches could open last Sunday and they did. God bless them.
I'm going to make moderator editorial comment here. I think Aaron pointed to this. It is true. One of the issues that we confront in the current situation is maintaining an appropriate unity of the church, capital C, extended church. And it's a reminder that we need to affirm that our unity is in the gospel, in Christ, not in difficult prudential judgments that we have to make about a whole lot of things. I mean, we could easily fall into the trap of American evangelicalism, where unity is found in whether you support Donald Trump or not. And there are many decisions in the public health area, in the political realm, that where people with the same goals may come to differing conclusions. So that's why I appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation. Now, I need to bring it to a close. But I want to say at the end, Dave, you've been quiet for almost all the conversation because so much of it is focused on the mechanics of pastoral ministry and in the church. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there any final comment you'd like to make about what has gone on here today?
Well, I really appreciate the conversation and the varying views, the varying way people have spoken, and it's been great. I would just remind us that Christ is going to build his church. It is Christ that builds the church. The power of the Spirit given at Pentecost, the power of the Word, the power of prayer. These are the core issues that will allow the mission of Christ to advance in the world. So I just kind of going back to a very basic level of what we understand the church is all about, and trust God that these realities are true. We live and die for them, and we hand it back to God to allow his church to grow, and even in a time like this.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that word. I've let this go a bit longer than anticipated. But I want to say thank you to all of you for participating. I think what we have done here is, within the constraints of our time and place, we have assembled to stimulate one another to love and good works. And hopefully we've stimulated one another to think more rigorously and carefully about how to lead God's people in these challenging times. And for those of you who will be watching this at some point, we trust that will be the effect in you and in the churches where you serve. So may the Lord, who is the head of the church, give us all great wisdom and great courage to be the church in our time and place.